Leap of Fate podcast fans. It's been 3 weeks, but we're back. I am back from my digital nomad travels. We're back to our regular scheduled programming. I have my friend Charles Vogl on today. Charles, say hi to the fans.
I'm glad to be here. Hello, all.
And we're going to have a great episode for you today. So again, I was traveling for about 20 days. I was in Miami and then in Puerto Rico, and I have a bunch of videos and podcasts coming out on my YouTube channel around digital nomading, everything like that. So we'll give you more information on the series. But today on the Leap of Fate, as we always talk about, is overcoming adversity, teaching life lessons, helping you be the best version of yourself. I have my friend Charles on. Let me give you the bio of Charles and why he's on and how he's going to enable our listeners today and how you can be the best version of yourself. Charles is an international best-selling author of not one, not two, 3 books. He works for Google in several capacities, including as a trusted thought leader of the Google School of Leaders, a program to develop 20,000 Google managers. He's also worked in other programs that include Airbnb, LinkedIn, Twitch, Amazon, ServiceNow, Wayfair, Meetup, and more. He's been able to be instruction, give presentations at the Yale Leadership Institute, the Harvard Law School, Stanford Graduate School of Business, and the U.S. Army. So he's very well educated. He's very well much a thought leader, and he's here to help us today talk about The Art of Community, which is his first book. We want to talk about community and how community can connect you around the world, how we can be a community to be the best successful people that we are, and how you can use the community around you to get you through the good times and the bad times. As we see the macroeconomic issues going on in the world, also the bigger issues in terms of the wars going on, it's very important for us to stay together in a community to try to have the best beliefs and best morals and be the best versions of ourselves and the best version of the community we can be. And then what I want to start with Charles today and bring him back in is talking about this is the Peace Corps. When he started in his early 20s, he was in the Peace Corps. And if you don't know what the Peace Corps is, I'll let Charles introduce that so that way he can bring him back in and talk about what he did in the Peace Corps and all about it. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Was that a good intro? Anything I missed in the intro there for you?
I think it's plenty of introduction for the conversation that we're going to have. And thanks for reading stuff off that lets people know that this is not my first time doing something.
Yeah, and so I love that. And again, as I said in the quick intro, so Peace Corps, I think a lot of people heard the name, but obviously someone as a alumni of the Peace Corps, can you talk about what it was, how you got into it and where you went, everything in between?
Yeah, well, the Peace Corps is a program of the United States government, and it's been around since the Kennedy administration. And the idea then was to send Americans with certain skills overseas, typically to developing countries, to offer skills that they may want, meaning other countries, to help. But as a practical matter, the Peace Corps has 3 goals. The first is to offer technical skills, be that in medicine, or in my case, I was working on water, sanitation, and health education in Southern Africa. And I was there during the AIDS epidemic, which was ravaging Southern Africa at the time. So that's the first goal. But then the second goal is for Americans to learn about other cultures. So I've now spent time in Zambia and know much more about Zambia and what we call Bantu culture than I would have otherwise. And then the third goal is to teach other countries about America and Americans. So for many of the people I was meeting, thousands and thousands of them, I may have been the only American they'll ever meet. And I was not there to exploit. I was not there to conquer. I was there to help. And so even if the technical parts of Peace Corps are not that impressive, because that was the first time I was in Southern Africa, and it was the first time I was teaching people how to stop oral fecal disease in a place as rural as I was, the other 2 goals happen with every day that I'm exposed to another culture and they get to meet me. And I was in Zambia for, I believe, 20 months, and I got very, very sick, which unfortunately is very common for volunteers working in Africa. We now know that I was exposed to malaria very early on. And the symptoms were suppressed largely because I was on a anti-malarial prophylaxis. But because I was infected, my body was fighting the parasites that cause malaria. the whole time. And eventually my symptoms were so great I couldn't function, and I came back early, a little bit early. Uh, and there you go. That's what the Peace Corps is.
Wild. So to take it then a step back, and we can dive much deeper into it. What made you want to join the Peace Corps initially, and what was the process like to get into it?
Yeah, well, I was in my early 20s. I entered the Peace Corps at 25, so I was applying in my early 20s, and I really wanted to do something with my life, with my youth, with my health that contributed, that made a difference. And I also knew I would never be as healthy again as I was in my early 20s and strong. And I wanted to challenge myself. So there's plenty of places to help in the United States. And in fact, before the Peace Corps, I was for a while living in and serving in radical homeless shelter in Southern California. Radical because it started by Dorothy Day. It's called the Catholic Worker. And it's radical because in that ministry, homeless people are invited to live in the same house as volunteers, so that there's community communing around that ministry. And so there are plenty of places in the United States that I could have helped. But I thought that joining the Peace Corps, I would find my limit. And I certainly did, physically, emotionally, culturally, linguistically, spiritually, whatever the limit was, I found it in the Peace Corps. And I must say, when I came back at 27 and had maxed out all my limits then, it really did set me up differently for the rest of my life. And I'll just say years later, oh gosh, 3 or 4 years later, I went to go shoot a documentary film in Cambodia. And because of the nature of the film, we had to go deep into the Cambodian bush to go find people who were involved in the war in the 1970s. And the director of the film was worried because I'd never been to Cambodia and I'd never been to the jungle, and there were no paved roads and all the things that go with going into rural jungle. She was concerned that I might not handle it very well. And I didn't know how I would handle it because I'd never been to the Cambodian jungle. Turns out when I got there, nothing we experienced came close to my personal threshold, because I'd hitchhiked across sub-Saharan Africa for months while suffering from malaria. And
Wow.
my point is that experience in the Peace Corps did prepare me then for whatever challenges I came. The other thing is I was traveling in sub-Saharan Africa alone, traveling with what in America we call a day pack. But because I was hitchhiking, we could only carry something the size of a day pack because you have to be able to put it in your lap when you find a vehicle. Very often we would get to checkpoints, or I would get to a checkpoint, and I'd be the only foreigner there. And the guys at the checkpoint with AK-47s would try to shake us down because they don't have money, and they assume that I have money, and I'm by myself, and I'm way deep into rural Africa. And I just got used to that, and I learned how to handle it. And we're trained how to handle it. But my point is, after spending over a year dealing with that kind of remoteness and intimidation, the kind of challenges that show up when I'm in more developed countries traveling, like, don't even register as real challenges, because I'm not by myself with very little supplies, getting shaken down by guys with guns.
So do you almost see yourself in your life like pre-Peace Corps and now post-Peace Corps, and it's really a defining factor?
I wouldn't say it's defining, but I think that that's not wrong, and that I came back obviously much more mature. Yeah. And the other thing that happened is I really learned what most of the world looks like, right? So in the United States, many millions of Americans have a working car, access to potable water, flushing toilets, access to some kind of transportation, and that's not true for much of the world.
Yeah.
And so to live in a place where there was no plumbing, which I really enjoyed, by the way, but there was no plumbing. And obviously we didn't have motor cars in our village. It just really taught me what the world actually looks like when you leave a place that is just so wealthy as the United States. Now, don't let me mischaracterize that. We know that the majority of Americans are really struggling to get by in the United States. And I mean, even eating enough. The number of American kids alone that don't eat enough is a tragedy. And we have a culture where there is plenty of food. And I'll give one example. One of the teenagers in my village who would help me came down with a rash that I assume was a fungal infection. And in our country, for less than $10, you'd go to a drugstore, you get a cream, and that'd be the end of it. But in the village, there was no drugstore, and he didn't have access to drugstore, and there was no medicine whatsoever. And so that became a life-changing, distracting infection.
Hmm.
And I recognized what it was, but I couldn't help in that. And it just really woke me up to how much we take for granted, how much I took for granted, that something like that would just, I wouldn't even think about it after a couple hours.
Yeah. And I think that's a good segue to the community part of the podcast. So like, what was it like being a part of the community as an outsider coming in? Did they accept you because you're part of the Peace Corps? Did they look outside of you and you had to prove yourself? You're there to help them. So how did you interact and become part of the community?
That is such a fantastic question. So I lived in a village called Lupasoshi. That was in the very northern part of Zambia, just south of the Zaire border. And the governance of the area is still aristocratic. And so there's a headman in charge of my village and beyond. And my village had about 150 families. And my headman could not have been more welcoming. And the Peace Corps at some level arranges with the local authority, both formal and informal, to have a Peace Corps volunteer there, because I'm by myself. I just learned the language, and even that is a really generous description of my ability with the language. Yeah. And I certainly didn't have any skills to live in a mud house in the jungle. It wasn't so much jungle, but the savannah sorts. It was a mix. Anyway, and so I need a lot of help. And one of the things, so the village in general was expecting me, and they're excited to have me. And I think they literally did everything they knew they could do to show that I was welcome. And years later, almost 20 years later, I still feel very warmly about how it was welcomed. And it was still overwhelming because there's a language barrier and then there's a culture barrier, and the culture barrier was enormous. And the village had provided me a mud house with a thatched roof there in the village. And I went to my neighbors. The family was called the Mwongo family, and I adopted them as my host family. And one of the ways I did is I showed up and I just sat in there. It's called Nsaka, their like hut in front of their house where they do the cooking and preparing of food and other things. And they knew I was there, and I was welcome to the village, so I wasn't shocking them. And I knew that I couldn't cook for myself because cooking takes an enormous amount of time. I didn't have the skills. And I made an arrangement where I would eat with them. And of course, I would fund whatever was fair to make that so. And spent time with them, and they took care of me. And so originally I made this arrangement where they would provide me meals. And the way they interpreted that originally was they sent over their eldest son with a platter of a meal to my home so I would eat by myself. And then I had to explain to them that's not what I was looking for, that I wanted to eat with them. And that was culturally appropriate to eat with other men in their home, and we were outside. It just shows that they were trying to be really respectful, giving me my space. And I reached out so that I could create those connections. And even then in the village, I didn't have any friends, and making friends is hard when you don't speak the language well. And so I remember forcing myself to every day go to a new home of about 150 families and just sit in there in Saka, which would be the equivalent of a front porch in our culture as far as its relationship to the family. So I wasn't like going into their living room unannounced and just sitting with them. And I couldn't understand the banter yet, but I had enough training to know that I was unthreatening, and they would be welcome into that, because everything is public when you don't do it behind walls, right? And I would just sit there, and they were very welcoming, and they'd offer me food and drink. And even though I didn't know what was going on, I would just force myself to be in that space to start creating a relationship and a presence, whatever possible. And so every day I would go to a new one, and the villagers talk, and they're not stupid, and they knew what I was doing. And so then they would predict that I'd be in a new house the next day. And I felt very, very welcome in my village. So
I love that. And what was your role in the village as you started to build that community, and how you were able to help out via the Peace Corps?
So when I was in the Peace Corps, the way it worked is I had a primary assignment, in this case, to work on water sanitation, hygiene education. And this was in the midst of a really deadly AIDS epidemic. And the life expectancy in Zambia at the time was about 35 years old.
Oh,
And infant mortality was 20%. So there was a
Mm.
lot of death going on. And the way the program worked is there was this knowledge that it would just take us a while to just adapt culturally. There's, the food is different. Obviously, the language is different. The culture is different. The type of housing is different. It just takes a while for your body just to adjust to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were allowed to work on any project we wanted to that was appropriate for, in my case, health and sanitation. And that could be anything from getting access to fresh water, teaching about hygiene, which is to say, stop the oral fecal cycle, anything that was AIDS related. In my particular village, we held a meeting of the 12 villages in the area where there was a vote on what I would work on. And I had counterparts in the village who would help organize that. And the villages voted that I would work on rehabilitating a UNICEF clinic that had been begun and abandoned some years earlier. And so there was a shell of a building that had never been used. And that was largely administrative. I had to go find out where was the money for that? Where did it go? How could we start that process again to get the building finished and funded by whatever funder, maybe UNICEF. And it was less about digging wells, which is, I think, how a lot of people think of Peace Corps volunteers. They're out there with a shovel, so to speak.
Understood.
But that's what the village wanted me to work on. And then a lot of it was cultural, my work there. And I know this is really controversial because at the end of the day, I was a Westerner with a college education in a place where literacy was not that great, bringing Western values. So one of the things that makes that infant mortality so high is the oral fecal cycle. So the places where soiled linens with baby poop are washed, and where dishes are washed, and where the water's gathered for food is often all the same place. And villagers often don't use, and often can't afford soap. And if you have kids pooping on things because they're kids and you don't have soap, you can see how that creates a problem.
Yep.
Well, women are the ones who clean the babies, clean the dishes, clean the clothes, fetch the water, and do the cooking. And so if you're going to attend to oral fecal cycle, women are involved in that. And a big part of that cycle is because there isn't agreed use of water sources and disposal of soiled things to separate soiled and clean water. And if women are doing it, it's pretty obvious you want to get the women involved and educated about how we're going to do this. However, for example, in Zambia, men, often men of rank, are the ones who make all the decisions. And we know how well it goes when someone who doesn't do the thing, right, tells other people who are doing the thing how to do it differently.
Yep.
So that means getting women involved in understanding what the problem is, and then deciding, well, then how are we going to arrange water use? In this case, it was a little river near our village. And that is a cultural shift, to invite women to come to a meeting, to invite women to make decisions, to invite women to execute those decisions, like enforcing where you can wash things and where you collect, clean water. And so there was a lot of that, and it's a very delicate thing.
And so were you able to be successful in helping try to bridge that culture gap and change what was happening?
I think I was terrible. And remember, I was in my 20s. And for all of us who got past our 20s, I think universally we look back and we're so embarrassed about what we did, thought we could do. And it's the same for me. However, there's a really fantastic story. Things got really, unfortunately, exciting for me in the village. The reason the UNICEF clinic had been abandoned was the money had been stolen, which is unfortunately very common in Zambia and countries in that region. And the people who had stolen the money, when they found out this American was looking for the trail of this money, didn't want me to work on that. And so the local authorities came to my village and kidnapped my best friend in the village. His name was Mr. Puta. And unfortunately, the guy he was working next to that day, and they had trumped up charges that he had stolen things, which he hadn't. And then they beat him in shifts for a couple of days, about 100 kilometers from our village. I didn't know this then. All I heard was the authorities, police, but police mean guys with guns in the back of a pickup, had come and picked him up. And we all thought there was a mistake because clearly he wasn't a criminal and clearly he didn't need to be hauled away. So I had sent some money with a villager to go pay for his transport back, assuming that once this was cleared up, he would come back to our village, the 100 kilometers. And it turns out that money was used as a bribe to release him. And it was all about warning me to stop looking at where the money had gone for the clinic. And so then my work turned into trying to find some kind of justice for my village and the surrounding villages, which were really living under violent tyranny. And I became more aware of that. And the reason they had kidnapped him was because they were unwilling to kidnap an American.
Yeah, and what that would mean.
So that was the warning. And then that was also a big lesson about what the world looks like, because there was no authority to turn to. These were the people who had done the kidnapping were the authorities. So remember, I got sick and I left, and I was weak and in pain, and I left, and I thought that I had got nothing done whatsoever, and had gone back to my life in America and got better. Well, after Facebook became a thing, some people in Zambia were able to contact me, and we were able to connect from thousands of miles away. And it turns out, I found out years later, that the organizing we had done, teaching the villagers to plan and teaching them where the money was and how to prepare the site, had actually resulted in the clinic opening. And to my understanding, that clinic is now serving thousands of families.
I love that.
And let me not take credit for that, because I'm going to stand by my original assessment that I was in my 20s and I'm embarrassed by what I thought I could do, what I tried to do, and how poorly I did it. Thank goodness that what I did was enough to inspire the villagers to do the hard work, that when I was gone, they did everything that was necessary to get that clinic working. And I'm very proud of what I did and know that I was a very small part of it.
Have you been back to the village since you left originally?
I haven't. It's in a very remote place. And once one flies into Lusaka, it took 5 to 7 days to get to my village. And the road from the closest thing that might be called a town that had at the time a phone, it was 60 miles, I believe, over a dirt road. And keep in mind, this is a dirt road in a country with a rainy season. So the potholes are actually bigger than vehicles.
Oh, wow.
And that when I was exposed to rabies, it took me 12 hours hitchhiking on 3 vehicles just to get to a phone one way. So you can imagine how it's hard to get there. And I just haven't gone back. And I have fantasies of doing that. And it could be that the transportation is much better there now, but it's a long way away and I haven't done it.
Well, that is a very inspiring story, that even if you feel like you didn't make the biggest impact, that you made an impact on the people who were able to change the community for the better. And the segue, that's the second part of this podcast, talking about community. How have you been able to take the learnings that you have learned from the Peace Corps into what you're doing today, and the different books that you've written, such as The Art of Community, and how we're building the community globally, locally today?
Well, I'm so glad you asked about the Peace Corps, because that perception of total failure in Zambia, where I tried to do something, it didn't have the skills, didn't have the language, didn't have the energy, didn't have the health to do anything, and then thought that not only did I fail in what I wanted to do, help get that clinic going, but maybe even created a worse situation where now local authorities were literally violently going after people in my village. That was dispiriting, to say the least.
Yeah.
And when I got back to the United States, and I was really burned out and cynical, because I had done my best and I'd gone where other people are often afraid to go, right? A foreign country in a rural place with a new language, and really had maybe made things worse instead of better. And I remember a mentor explaining to me that what I needed to learn was that to really make a difference in the world, maybe in my life, I needed to not rely on just me having the skills. I had this perception that I had gotten maybe osmotically that, well, to make a difference, what you need is to get a whole bunch of skills and use them. And he said, look, if you're the most skilled person, but it's just you working, you're probably not going to get much done in this world. But if you build the skill to invite other people around a shared value toward a shared purpose, and if you invite 5 people a day, and so what is that? That's 35 people a week.
Mm-hmm.
And let's pretend you're 90% a failure. That means roughly 3 people a week will say yes. Well, after a year, you're going to have 150 people altogether working on something that's important. And that's if you're 90% a failure about inviting people together.
Mm.
Now, those are just made up numbers, but the principle is sound. What I need to get good at if I want to make a difference in my life and my time here, the skill I needed to build was, how do we bring people together? And not just bring together necessarily to have a good time or so that we can brag that we're well networked, but so that we can make a difference around a shared value and a shared purpose. And that was really a shift for me. And maybe I needed the nadir of my Peace Corps experience to teach me, okay, I don't know how to do this. And subsequently, when I started making that documentary film that went on to be funded by PBS and was about a Cambodian family escaping the genocide there and becoming American, I started without funding, without skills, without access to people with skills. What I had to get good at was finding people who knew how to do that and get them involved and do it authentically, right? Because I wasn't tricking anybody. And in many ways, that was the crucible for me to learn, how do I just start from zero and collect people to create something bigger than I can do myself. And I think that changed the rest of my life. And then subsequent to that, I was waiting tables as a young filmmaker in New York, as so many people are. And eventually I was able to quit waiting tables to be a full-time filmmaker, albeit making almost nothing. And when I was waiting tables, I'd experienced worker abuse, which is unfortunately rampant in restaurants because restaurant workers often don't have legal resources and often citizenship. And so I got involved in labor organizing for restaurant workers to bring justice to the work, and worked with an organization called Restaurant Opportunity Center New York. And then that was another venue where I needed to bring people together, in this case, restaurant workers, to stand together to protect themselves. So then when I got to graduate school, I went to the grad school to study religion, philosophy, and ethics. And then eventually, because I was there, business, I discovered all these other people who also want to make a difference with their lives and are getting fancy educations to do it. And learned that they too really didn't understand, how do we bring people together to do this? And then that's when I was invited to start guest lecturing around that. We call it leadership, when you lead people. Right? And then I was delighted to find out that these lessons I learned over years the hard way, literally hitchhiking across Africa, literally shooting in Cambodia, literally at fundraisers across the United States, these are the skills I could transfer to other people who also wanted to learn to be more powerful than they were alone. And that's the first book, which you mentioned.
Awesome. And what was the reception to the book like? Was you able to get like critically acclaimed? Were you able to be like New York Times bestseller, or was it more just like a thought leadership for people to be able to utilize?
So the book has done very well, which is why I have 3 books out.
Yeah, so congratulations.
Publishers don't usually want to publish the next book if the first one can't get any attention. Technically, it has won an award. So
congratulations.
Other authors consider that pretty good. And the book has been really adopted by people high up in the U.S. military. That includes the Pentagon, the education system. So educators on the front line of seeing how isolated and lonely our time is, our era. And so a lot of schools have adopted the book. So I should explain to your listeners, the first book is entitled The Art of Community, 7 Principles for Belonging. And in it, I distill 7 principles that I recognized in my studies that wisdom traditions, spiritual wisdom traditions, have used for literally millennia to bring people around shared values and purpose. And since these are very, very old ideas, they're not faddy. They're not based on contemporary research. They're ideas that hopefully our grandparents saw were used. So for example, one of the ideas is this idea that there are elders, and elders aren't there just to brag that they're older or more senior in a community than other people. The elders are there to help younger members mature into who they want to be. And all of us have been part of a group or a community where the elders didn't get that, and they were just jerks or snooty. and we know exactly how much we wanted to be there, and we know exactly how much they helped us grow into who we want to be. Well, what if we all had the wisdom that said, when people show up because they want to do something like we do, make documentary film, work in international development, conquer loneliness in schools across America. What if when they showed up to participate with us, we understood as elders, our job is to help them mature since they showed up? That would change everything. Right. So that's discussed in the principle we call the inner rings principle, that within any community, there are smaller rings and some of those are elders. Right.
Got it.
So that book distills down very, very old ideas, and they're time tested. And the principles can be used anywhere, be that the US military, a school, or very, very large corporations. So right now, I can talk a little bit about, I've been working with Google now for several years, and Google's in a very, very dynamic market. And there are certain people that it's very important for Google to connect, to collaborate, to innovate, and do something new for the future. And so one of the things we can do is we can use these principles to help what we call knit together relationships to make them a stronger community, so there can be collaboration there for the future instead of hoping things happen by chance.
I got it. Love that. So then, have you ever been out on the street or been somewhere and someone's like, hey, I read your book, and just randomly they recognize you because of it, or any of your books?
People don't recognize me typically by looking at me, because I don't think many people just know what authors look like in general.
Fair enough.
However, I have been places where when people find out the books I've written, they've shared with me that my book is used in their organization. I went to a social event here in the Bay Area, and there was a woman there who met my wife. And then when she found out who my wife was married to, she revealed that she had been given my first book by a very senior executive at one of the largest companies in the world, when she was onboarding at that very, very large company. Wow. And I remember that we were shocked that I wasn't even there, that my wife met someone at a party and just on hearing my name shared that my book was being passed around by this very, very famous company.
Awesome. So just in terms of like personal, like how does that make you feel knowing the impact of what you've learned in Africa and just in general, and taking those teachings, spreading it across the world, and coming back to you through a telephone game pretty much, and seeing the impact it can have?
I'm proud that something that I invested in is making a difference for other people. I don't think of anything that I wrote in that first book as new. I might be wrong about that. My job, at least in my mind, was simply to distill and translate very old ideas so that they were accessible to contemporary leadership, nonprofit, political, social, commercial. And so I'm very proud that I was able to put it in a form that it could be embraced. And I also know that we're in a terribly lonely time. And the research is really clear that we almost certainly are living in the loneliest era in history. And if you want, we can talk about why that is. It's not an accident.
Yeah.
And so when I hear that my work is making a difference, what I'm hearing is somebody is finding a respite from this lonely era because my work is helping them create a better culture, at least in their experience. And many of the people using my book have a lot of influence with millions, and in some cases, hundreds of millions of people. And so knowing that my work is helping at some level above zero connect millions of people, whether they ever hear of me or know that's coming from my work, relieves me that there's some pain in the world that we're addressing. And what I hope is when any person gets better at bringing people together authentically, that those lessons stick with them and are relevant for the rest of their lives. And as much as that is true, they're influencing the next generation. And none of those people may know that I'm involved or my work had anything to do with it. And if we're moving the needle on this loneliness for more than one generation, that gives me hope.
I love that. I love that. That's a really profound answer. And I would say, from just hearing you talk about it, if I feel the same way on my podcast. Like if someone can hear this or someone can see something put out and it can change their life, they can tell someone what they heard, and it can change one person's life, then it makes all the hard hours, all the editing, all the work that goes into it so worth it. And you're doing that just obviously much more on a bigger scale, but it's the same type of impact that we can have, just with the ultimate goal of trying to change the community, change the world for a better place.
Yeah, your comment reminded me of something. I want to share it with you just because maybe it'll inspire you in the years you're going to be practicing your work. There's a very famous 20th century monk named Thomas Merton, who is most of his life based out of monastery in Kentucky. And he wrote a very famous piece. It's called Letter to a Young Activist. You can Google that. And in it, he shares the wisdom, do not depend on the hope of results. And I'll speak to that, how I interpret that. You know, I've worked on a number of things in my life: worker abuse, human rights abuse, epidemic, AIDS epidemic, trauma healing with the Cambodian genocide, education work, and now loneliness. And in every one of those cases, I never woke up and thought someday trauma is not going to be an issue, loneliness isn't going to be an issue, worker abuse isn't going to be like we're going to handle it, right? And those things are important to work on. They're fundamentally important to work on because it makes a difference to people. And if we just give up the hope of results and we just do the work because we think the work is important, then it gives us a freedom to do what we think is important and stop concerning whether we're doing enough, or we're doing it better than other people, and whether we're completing it. And when I wrote that book, that first book, I literally wrote it in my pajamas in a studio apartment overlook a parking lot in West Oakland, California, because we just newly moved to the Bay Area. I didn't have a book deal. Nobody asked me to write a book. I didn't know when I'd get a book deal. And if I got a book deal, I didn't know if anybody would read the book. And if anybody did read the book, I didn't know if it would make a difference to anybody. I just spent the months writing it. And my wife, bless her, she got up every day and went to a real job with health insurance, so her husband could stay home in his pajamas, and he told people he was writing a book. And, you know, now you and I are talking, and we know that the work is used around the world. And I can share here that Twitch, which is the largest platform for online gaming video. How to say this succinctly? The people in charge of the 200 million memberships, the executives in charge of the 200 million members of Twitch are fans of my work, and I know that my work was used and is used to influence how Twitch is formed. So I know that my work is affecting the experience of no less than 200 million people just at Twitch alone, right? And now I can say that, but I didn't know that sitting in front of the computer with a wife who was going to work and paying for all the health insurance. And the reason I could get through that, the reason I could do everything else, not knowing if this would ever make a difference, is at some level, I had to not depend on the hope of results and do the thing that I thought was important for the world and might make a difference to someone. And if I was wrong, well, that's how it goes.
I love that. And I would say, honestly, if you have 200 million people just from Twitch, let's just exponentially say that. Let's just say a billion people have probably seen your work at some point or have been impacted by it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to name drop here about other large corporations. Twitch, it's public because we have endorsements from Twitch. But there are other large organizations that I know that my work is used.
Understood.
And yes, it's a very big number. But I want to go back, though, to what we said earlier. It doesn't matter that those people ever know that my work was involved. And even if they did, that doesn't help me make a big difference going forward in a way that matters. Because the next person needs to find out that my work is relevant to them, and I need to make it relevant to them. And I need to do it in a way that actually enriches their life and isn't some game. For example, you'll hear people write books and they say, oh, books are great because they're a big calling card. I.e., if you write a book and people see you wrote a book, then they'll want to hire you. Well, look, if people want to hire me, great. But I don't want them to hire me because I wrote a great calling card. And I don't want them to spend 5 to 6 hours with one of my books because it's a calling card. I want them to find my work, spend 5 to 6 hours with it because it's going to literally change the rest of their lives. Yep. If you at 29 years old learn how to bring people together that you care about in ways that bond you emotionally and intellectually and support you in down times at 29, and you're going to make it to 80, I'm so glad I wrote something that in 5 hours could shift that.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't care if it's a good calling card or not.
I love that. I think that's a really good segue. To have one more question for you, and you've been very generous with time. I'll let you go. So, in today's world, obviously, we just talked about whole community. How can people today, in their own world, make an impact in, if it's a local level, a state level, governmental, world level, with everything going on, so much divisiveness, so much hatred? How can people today try to make the best impact themselves for the better?
Well, I'm going to stick to an answer just relative to my work because I know
Sure.
my work or my field. We've already mentioned in this podcast that everybody that's listening right now is living in the loneliest era probably of ever. And all of us didn't ask to be born in the loneliest era ever. And I'm pretty pessimistic about where we're going because of the forces that got us here. I'm optimistic of the difference that we can make when we show up and understand how to bring people together. And we could talk a lot about how to bring people together. That's why there are 3 books on the subject, but it always starts at the same place. And that's with an invitation. And every time that you were lonely, have you ever been lonely?
Yes.
Oh, you have. Okay, good. So you and I have share something.
Yeah.
Every time you were lonely, what you really wanted and would have made a difference was an invitation from someone to spend time with them, right? And eating a bowl of noodles together would have totally counted. Walking around a park together would have counted, right? We're not talking about like invited to go on a super bash somewhere. Sharing a bowl of noodles would have totally counted. So one of the things that we can do is we can notice who do we want to spend more time with and just invite them to spend time, and walking around a park counts. Quite frankly, sitting on a park bench, drinking a hot beverage counts. And when we invite, it almost doesn't matter whether others accept our invitation. Because when we make an invitation, a couple of things happen whether they accept or not. The first one is they get evidence that somebody in the world thinks they belong with us because we invited them to share a bowl of noodles or walk around a park. The second thing that's happening is they see that they know somebody that has the power to bring people together. And when we're lonely, what we really want to know is people who have the power to bring people together.
Yep.
And when we talk about invitations, we never know why others don't accept an invitation. There are people right now listening to us who have kids with special needs at home. And that takes a lot of time, maybe all of their time. And they may never accept a dinner invitation out because there's somebody in their family that needs attention. And there are people who are taking care of elderly parents, and maybe they can't ever go out in the evening because they got to take care of kids. Fine. They want the invitation. And if they always say no, those 2 things that I mentioned still count. They get evidence that somebody thinks they belong, and they know somebody can bring people together. So if nothing else happens, if we notice where we're sending out more invitations, we're knitting people together in more powerful ways than the default of our culture. And that can make a radical change.
I love that. And I completely agree. I feel like even if you just make the effort, people feel different because they appreciate the effort and they feel the love. And as you said, maybe they can't make it, but just knowing that you're wanted and you're not just a human being that people just see and they walk by you and they don't look at you in the eyes, they look down at you. Feeling valued is extremely important. I think in today's world, a lot of people have lost that respect and ethics of valuing each other as human beings on this world together, and see each other as a, lack of a better term, a race, a religion, a different type of country that you don't believe in their beliefs. And we need to get back to the core values of respecting each other as human beings and giving us that respect. And I think it will bring a better prosperity of peace and happiness to everybody involved.
Well, that happens when we take the time to have what we call in my work intimate experiences. We get to know people for who they are when we're in a space where we can know them for who we are. And I think it's no accident that we are a divided country and we're an extremely lonely country. If I'm not spending the time to connect with the people around me, guess what? It's easy to misunderstand them and hate them.
Yep.
Right? Now, I might hate other people when I get to know them. Right?
Fair. Fair.
Right? But we know that there's no other option if I don't take that time.
Yep.
And
You're just
work.
making judgment based off of a surrounding that you don't actually know is other.
Yeah.
What do you say? Don't judge a book by its cover.
Yeah. And it's important for everybody listening to us right now to understand that we are all surrounded by people who are lonely. The research shows, just for example, that 15% of American men don't have any close friends. 15.
That's a
The
lot.
last concert you went to, there were more than 15 men there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, roughly two of them don't have close friends. It's a nightmare out there.
It is. And I think that is a good kind of place for us to stop the podcast and kind of say thank you so much for your time, because that could take us a whole nother subject. But I want to take it back to you, Charles, and say thank you so much for your time today. Just as a quick recap for the audience, if you have a 30-second, if there's one takeaway from them that you want them to know from today's talk with you, what would that be?
If and when you're feeling lonely, you're not alone. You're surrounded by an entire generation that's feeling lonely. And when we understand that, I hope that gives us all the confidence that others want us to connect and make those invitations. We're afraid to do so, to find out that we're all feeling alone together.
I love that. That's perfect. If you're going to definitely see that on social media, that's a great quote for everybody. Charles, if people want to find you, if they want to find your books, everything that you say right now, of course, will be in the bio if you're watching or streaming or just using audio. But if they want to connect with you directly, how people may do that?
Great. I have a website. It's charlesvogl.com. That's charlesvogl.com. And there you'll also find free downloads to use the ideas that I talk about that I said are very, very old and time tested. And then my books, all three of them are wherever books are sold. And I encourage you to grab that. And then I have my own podcast called the New Era, Old Wisdom, New Era. I want to say that again. You can edit that. I have my own podcast called the Old Wisdom, New Era, where I discuss the lessons that form us and give our lives meaning.
Love that. And again, everything he said will be in the bio about how you're listening and streaming on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, all of it. Charles, thank you so much for coming on today. You've really helped us talk about community and spreading love around the world. So really go ahead and do our sign-offs. I'd like you to repeat after me. Stay healthy.
Stay healthy.
Stay wealthy.
Stay wealthy.
And have a great week, fans.
And have a great week, fans.
Deuces.